Please don't leave.
The river was swollen from 3 days of mountain rain, turning the normally docile water into a churning monster of mud and fury. Elena Garrett had known better than to cross it. She lived in the frontier territories long enough to understand that rivers didn't care about schedules, about need, about desperation. But her daughter was sick in the next town over, and Elena had medical supplies that couldn't wait. She was a widow of 2 years. Her husband had been killed by a bucking horse, and she'd learned to ignore caution in favor of necessity. The horse stumbled. Elena fell. The water was shockingly cold, shockingly powerful, shockingly indifferent to her struggle. She went under once, came up gasping, went under again. Her skirts tangled around her legs, pulling her down, and she understood with absolute clarity that this was how she would die, alone in a river, unable to help her child, unable to finish the life she'd been trying so desperately to build. Then strong hands grabbed her. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of strength that seemed impossible, hauled her out of the water and onto the muddy bank. She coughed and gasped and felt the earth beneath her, felt the sun on her face, understood that she was still alive. "Easy," the man said, his voice rough with exertion. "You're safe. You're going to be fine." Elena looked up at him and saw a face weathered by sun and wind, eyes the color of weathered leather, a scar running from temple to jaw. He was perhaps 45, dressed in worn clothes, moving with the careful caution of someone accustomed to giving help that people rarely expected from someone who looked like him. "My daughter," Elena gasped. "I have to." "Your daughter is going to need you alive," the man said firmly. "Not drown in a river. We're going to get you dry. We're going to get you warm. And then we're going to figure out your next move. My name is Samuel Hart. I have a cabin about a mile from here." The cabin was small but solid, built with care and maintained with precision. Samuel got a fire going immediately, then turned to Elena with a kind of matter-of-factness that suggested he'd dealt with emergencies before. "Your clothes are soaked," he said. "You'll catch pneumonia if you don't get out of them. I have blankets by the fire. You can dry off and change there while I get supplies together. I assume you were heading somewhere specific." "Three Creek," Elena said through chattering teeth. "My daughter Emma is there with my sister. She has fever. I have quinine and other medicines." Samuel nodded. 3 Creek is half a day's ride. But first, you need to not die of exposure. Go. Get dry. I'll prepare supplies. Elena moved behind a blanket Samuel had strung up, and she began the process of removing her soaked clothing. Her hands shook from cold, from shock, from the vulnerability of being half naked in a stranger's cabin. But there was something in Samuel's manner that suggested he wasn't the kind of man who would take advantage of vulnerability. He seemed, in fact, designed to protect it. When she emerged from behind the blanket, wrapped in a blanket that still held the warmth of the fire, Samuel had prepared food, broth, bread, dried fruit. He passed her a cup of hot coffee, without comment. "Your clothes will dry by morning," he said. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, I'll take you to 3 Creek." Elena wanted to protest. She had a daughter who needed her, but the fever of exhaustion and shock was settling over her, and she understood that Samuel was right. She needed sleep, needed warmth, needed to recover enough to actually help her daughter instead of collapsing on the trail. She woke in the morning to sunlight and the smell of coffee. Samuel was sitting by the window, reading a book with the intensity of someone who'd read it many times before. He looked up when Elena stirred, and something in his expression suggested he'd been awake for hours, watching over her. "Your clothes are dry," he said. "There's breakfast when you're ready." Elena dressed quickly, aware of her state of undress in a stranger's home, aware that she slept alone in his cabin, while he'd apparently sat by the fire all night. When she emerged, she found him preparing supplies for travel. Food, water, bandages, medicines. "Are you coming with me?" Elena asked. "I am," Samuel confirmed. "Your daughter is sick, and you're a widow alone on dangerous roads. I'm not letting you travel unprotected." The ride to 3 Creek took longer than anticipated. The roads were muddy from the rain, the terrain treacherous. Samuel moved his horse close to hers throughout the journey, his hand often reaching out to steady her, his eyes constantly assessing for danger. When they finally reached 3 Creek, Elena's sister was waiting on the porch, her expression transforming from worry to confusion when she saw the stranger alongside Elena. "Who is this?" she asked. "This is Samuel Hart," Elena said. "He saved my life from the river yesterday, and he traveled all this way to ensure I arrived safely." Elena's sister, a woman named Margaret who'd always been suspicious of Elena's independence, studied Samuel with an expression that suggested she was calculating something. "You should come inside," she said finally. "It's the least we can offer for saving my sister." Samuel stayed for 3 days. He helped care for Emma, bringing her water, reading to her, moving through the sick room with the kind of gentleness that suggested he'd done this before. He talked with Margaret about frontier medicine, about treatments and remedies, about the careful balance between hope and realism when dealing with illness. On the 3rd night, Emma's fever broke, and she began to recover. Elena found Samuel sitting on the porch, looking at the stars, and she understood that he was preparing to leave. "You should stay," Elena said, surprising herself with the boldness of it. Samuel turned to look at her, and his expression was carefully neutral. "I can't stay. I'm not the kind of man who stays in places. I pass through, I help when I can, I move on." "Why?" Elena asked. "Why move on when you could build something? A life, a home, connections." "Because staying requires believing that you deserve to stay," Samuel said quietly. "And I stopped believing that a long time ago." Elena moved closer, and the night felt large and full of possibility. "Will you stay?" she asked, and there was vulnerability in her voice. Vulnerability she spent 2 years learning to hide. "Even just one more night?" Samuel looked at her, at this woman he'd pulled from a river, at this woman who'd shown him kindness despite his obvious damage, at this woman who was asking him to believe he could be more than a wanderer. "If you're asking what I think you're asking," Samuel said carefully, "you need to know that I'm broken in ways that might not be fixable, that staying in one place terrifies me, that loving someone requires believing I deserve to be loved, and that's a belief that's hard to come by." "I'm not asking you to be fixed," Elena said. "I'm asking you to try. For me, for Emma, for whatever this would become." Samuel stayed. He didn't leave the next morning or the morning after. He helped Elena find a larger house in Three Creek, a place where a widow and her daughter could build a new life. He went to work at the local ranch, becoming known as a man who was reliable, capable, and kind. He and Emma developed a relationship that suggested he'd found in her the child he'd always wanted but never believed he deserved. 6 months later, Elena and Samuel were married in a quiet ceremony at the church in Three Creek. Emma stood beside them, fully recovered, holding flowers she'd grown herself. 1 year into their marriage, sitting on the porch of their home as the sunset painted the sky, Elena asked Samuel something she'd been wondering since that night on the other porch. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "When I asked you that night, you could have left. You could have continued being a wanderer. What made you choose to stay?" Samuel took her hand, and his expression held the complexity of a man who'd been broken and had chosen to let himself be healed. "Because you asked," Samuel said simply, "and because for the first time in my life, I believed that staying was possible. You saw me, not the version I thought I was, but something better. You believed in me before I believed in myself." Elena leaned against him, understanding that sometimes the boldest thing a person can do is ask someone to stay, and the truest thing someone can do is actually stay. 5 years later, the house was filled with laughter and life. Elena had established herself as a healer in Three Creek, using her knowledge of medicine to help others. Samuel had become the foreman of the ranch, known for his fairness and his unexpected gentleness. Emma was growing into a strong young woman, and they'd welcomed 2 more children into their family. The man who'd said he didn't deserve to stay had become the foundation of everything. Not because he was perfect, but because he'd been brave enough to believe that love could transform him, brave enough to choose stability over wandering, brave enough to trust that he could be something more than his damage suggested. And the widow who'd asked a stranger to stay had discovered that sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't dramatic rescues. They're simple requests, vulnerable moments, the willingness to ask for what you need, and trust that someone will be brave enough to answer. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Samuel and Elena returned to the river, the place where he'd pulled her from the water, the place where everything had changed. "If I could go back," Elena said, looking at the river. Knowing what I know now, I would still have crossed it, because it led me to you. And if I could go back, Samuel said, pulling her close, I would have pulled you from that river 1,000 times over, because that was the moment I stopped being a wanderer and became someone who could actually stay. The river that had almost killed her had instead given her everything. And the broken man who thought he didn't deserve love had discovered that sometimes all it takes is someone brave enough to ask you to stay, and someone strong enough to believe that you actually can. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't about grand gestures. They're about the simple courage it takes to be vulnerable, to ask for what you need, and to trust that someone will be brave enough to answer with their whole heart. That was everything.